It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like the content of our show, check out our new Patreon, the Opperman Report Patreon, where we have all kinds of exclusive content up there that you won't be able to find anywhere else. I'm uploading 8 hours a month of exclusive content on there, plus documents. I got the Proud Boys document I just put up there. A lot of good stuff. But our archives are always free, and you can find that at Spreaker.com. And if you go to Spreaker.com, you can find our guest today, Matt Sergiou, who has a website called, what is this? Conspiro Media. Conspiro Media. And what's the other one you do with the Beatles, the occult Beatles?
The occult Beatles, yes. It's at wordpress.com. Yeah.
And now, are you still doing that? Are you still doing the podcast about the occult Beatles?
What, the Magical Mystery Talk?
Yeah.
You're talking about that I do with Mark Devlin and Desiree Hall from the Number 9 blog, another Beatles blog. Yes, still doing that. We've done, I think, in total, it's 3 episodes or maybe 4. No, I think it's 3 we've done. I think we did the first one in 2019. We were hoping to do a lot more than just 3. We were hoping. The original plan when we started it was to do maybe 3 or 4 topically related Beatles podcasts, topically related, but at the same time looking at things from an alternative angle. So looking at things that are going on within the Beatles world, that is going on in the news at the moment, but looking at it from an alternative angle. And we were hoping to do about 3 or 4 of those a year, but then this Corona thing came along, and it's kind of like sort of derailed things a little bit. We've done 1 this year, which is not what we wanted to do. We wanted to do a lot more than 1 in 2020, but yeah. So in total, we've done 3. I think the most recent one was about 2.5 months ago.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and I believe we have those. We have a special channel for that on my Spreaker channel for Matt here.
Yeah,
with the
I think you've got 2 episodes on there at the moment. The first 2.
Oh, okay, yeah, Magical Mystery Talk.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, you wrote an article, and we can find this on your Conspiro Media, WordPress.com, the Music Military Government Complex. Give us an overall broad explanation what that is.
Well, what the Conspiro Media site is all about, the Occult Beatles one is self-explanatory. What I'm aiming to do at the moment with Conspiro Media, with this particular website, and there's also an offshoot. There's a Facebook site for that as well. It's been going since 2012, 2011, but what I've been doing with it in more recent years, in the last 2 or 3 years, is kind of looking at the 1960s countercultural scene, a little bit in the way that David McGowan was with the Laurel Canyon scene. But what David was doing, of course, was looking at it from the American angle. Partly inspired by that, some years back, I thought to myself, well, if this was going on in America, this conspiratorial occult stuff was going on in America to do with the 60s counterculture, then it must have been going on in Britain and predominantly in London. So in the last 3.5, 4 years, as well as concentrating on the Beatles with my Occult Beatles website, I've also been refocusing my Conspiro Media site and my research in that sphere towards the 60s counterculture scene and London, to see whether there are any similarities with regards to what was going on in London with what was going on in America with regards to what David McGowan was looking at. And at the moment, from the research that I've done, all the books I've read, all the data I've collected so far, yes, it would look that way. It would certainly look that way. I still have
real quick for a second. For a second, people that aren't familiar with Dave McGowan's work, Dave McGowan passed away from cancer about 3 or 4 years ago. Right? It's been quite a while.
Yeah.
It's greatly missed, but he had a life of work, research, and one of his biggest theories was covered in the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, about how all the counterculture musicians of the 60s and early 70s had all these connections to military and intelligence in their family or in their background, and he believed that there was a pattern to that, of possibly manipulating even the fashion of the time, and that the whole counterculture revolution was really, I guess, a government military type operation to mold America.
Yeah, sure. And he also discovered that a lot of the music stars, the so-called countercultural heroes, the musicians of the time, had these kind of family backgrounds that were connected to the military, to intelligence, and also sort of aristocracy kind of lineage as well. Genealogy. So I sort of picked up the ball and ran with it with regards to the UK to see if there was any kind of similarity. And yes, like I say, there does seem to be that kind of thing going on at the moment, from what I've discovered so far. As I say, as I was trying to say earlier, I have yet to publish a lot of this online, and the reason for that is because there is so much still to discover, and I want to make sure before I do put it online that what I do put online is as close to factual as I possibly can get it. I don't just want to go full steam into just posting any old thing. I want to make sure that I get my facts as correctly as possible. So that's where I am at the moment with Conspiromedia, the website, because when I initially started Conspiromedia back in 2012, I was basically trying to make it a topical website, basically looking at the occult conspiratorial world of movies, music and TV, and as I say, looking at it from a topical perspective. So anytime something happened, whether it was to do with Lady Gaga or some rapper or hip-hop star, I would sort of latch onto that and try to write an article around that and research into whatever that story was, whatever it may have been that was attached to that particular music star. But after a while, I got a little bit bored of that because it's not really what I want. I never lived through the 1960s, but it's something that really, really interests me. I love the music. From an early age, for some reason, I got attached to 60s music, even though I never really lived through it. I find the history fascinating. And I just, while I was going along with this, with Conspiromedia in the earlier days, looking at Lady Gaga and Britney Spears and all that kind of thing, I just got a little bit jaded with it. It got to the point where it was, oh, here we go again. So what? Yeah, here's Britney Spears doing another triangle symbol over her eye in a pop video. It just got a little bit, I don't know, I just got a bit bored with it. And when David McGowan came along with the Laurel Canyon research, I don't know, I was just, it kind of connected with me in some way. And looking at the London scene, I just thought maybe there is a connection there must be a connection. If there was this conspiratorial thing going on in America, as David McGowan saw it, then it must have been going on in London. So that's the direction I've taken Conspiromedia in more recent years, and it has to be. I mean, if like I say, if it was going on in America, it must have been going on in the UK, because I would even argue that without the UK, I would argue that perhaps the American California Haight-Ashbury scene wouldn't have been so potent. For example, Timothy Leary, who was kind of like the guru who turned on the younger generation of the 1960s, predominantly in America, but then throughout the world, he was initially turned on by a British guy by the name of Michael Hollingshead. You also look at the word psychedelic. It was coined by a British doctor. I think his name, if I'm not mistaken, was Dr. Humphrey Osmond. Then you have Aldous Huxley, who is looked upon as the kind of like a godfather of the countercultural, acid, trippy kind of psychedelic movement. British again. Okay, he lived in the US towards the end of his life and in the later years of his life, but he's another British guy. And then you have the Beatles, who were, without argument, the most popular band of the 1960s. They were the flag wave bearers of the countercultural movement, and I would argue that without the Beatles, the countercultural movement, both in the US and throughout the so-called Western world, wouldn't have been as potent, wouldn't have been as powerful. And they were the most popular band. They were the most popular band, the most popular entertainers in the world at that time, and they picked up this flag for the psychedelic movement and championed it, especially throughout 1967 through the so-called Summer of Love. I mean, like I say, I didn't live through the 1960s, but from what people who lived at that time have said, and historians and so on have said, the Sgt. Pepper album is regarded as the kind of like the soundtrack of the so-called Summer of Love, and that's both in Britain and America. So if it was going on in America, if this conspiratorial thing was going on in America with the counterculture, it had to have been going on in Britain, and I would say it was going hand in hand. It was vital, maybe.
Yeah, and some of the things you found in this article that you sent me, the music, military, government complex, and people should go to conspiromedia.com and follow along as we're doing this interview. Give us the background of Decca Records.
Okay, so to the point then. Okay, because I do tend to go off. I do go off on tangents, so I do apologise.
You're fine, man. You're fine.
Okay, right. So the reason I put together this article that I'm going to explain a little bit about now is it's kind of like when you read a book and you get the foreword, you get kind of like the introduction before you go into the book. Well, this is kind of like what this article is. It's kind of like an introduction to before you go into the 1960s counterculture. So although I haven't published a lot on my website about what I've been talking about just now, but it will be published in months and years to come. All going well, this stuff will be posted onto this website. But before that happens, you can regard this article that's on the website at the moment to do with what I'm about to talk about as the introduction to that. So I'm talking here predominantly about Britain, although it does bleed into America as well. There are various record companies, two record companies in particular, that have roots to the military, and you mentioned Decca Records. Now, Decca Records is a British company. It's still going now, but it was mainly in the vanguard, if you like, in the 1950s. Well, actually, the 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s. And in the 1960s, it was the record label which it signed the Rolling Stones. And it was the Rolling Stones label for most of the 1960s, up until about 1971, or around about that time. And it's actually the Rolling Stones that kind of directed me towards looking at this particular field of research. And it was a quote that was put together that I found actually in a Rolling Stone article, a quote from Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones. And I'm actually going to read it to you now a little bit, because I've got it here in front of me on my computer screen. This was about 1971, a magazine interview in 1971 for Rolling Stone magazine, if I'm not too mistaken. And this was around the time that the Rolling Stones left Decca Records and went to form their own record company, or their own label. And what Keith Richards said was, and I quote, "We found out, and it wasn't years till we did, that all the bread, all the money we made for Decca was going into making little black boxes that go into American Air Force bombers to bomb North Vietnam. They took the bread we made for them and put it into the radar section of their business. When we found that out, it blew our minds. That was it. It just blew his mind, he says. He goes on to say, you've helped to kill God knows how many thousands of people without even knowing it. Now, it turns out that he's, Keith Richards has a way of, has a particular way with words, but round and about, he's right. It's actually true.
But Matthew, you know what's interesting though is that so many people, the question is, were the Beatles, were the Stones, were they complicit in this brainwashing, mind control, culture control, or were they naive? And I guess this shows that they were naive, right? This quote.
It's the $1 million question, isn't it? It would suggest, if you read into that quote from Keith Richards, that they were naive. Yeah. But then again, to play devil's advocate, someone who's listening to this might say, that's part of the conspiracy. They're just playing naive,
Right.
They're just playing with your head and trying to play chess with your head, so...
Well, then you'll have the group that says you and me are in on it too, so it never ends.
Yeah, exactly. They're bluffing you. They're double bluffing you or something like that. Yeah. So when you start thinking like that, your head goes crazy, doesn't it? Well, mine does, so I try not to. But yeah, he's absolutely right. Like I say, he's Keith Richards has got a way with words, his own particular way of saying things. But he's right. During the Vietnam War, Decca Records was, part of Decca Records, or what you would call the Decca Navigator Company, which was part of Decca, was supplying radar to the US forces in Vietnam. And not only was it supply, and I think they were put into their helicopters. They were radar systems that Decca built and manufactured, and they were placed into the actual helicopters, if I'm not mistaken. And I think what Decca was also doing, it was training US troops, who in turn would then go on to train other troops in how to use this radar. How Decca got into this initially, you have to go back to the Second World War. When Decca actually started, I think they were called the Decca Graphophone Company. They started in Britain, as I mentioned earlier. I think that was sometime in the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. I can't quite remember when it was. It was in the 1910s, I think it was, when they started as the Decca Graphophone Company. And basically, what the Decca Graphophone Company was, it was a company that made what you would now call stereo equipment, music equipment. So they made graphophone players, equipment that you could play music on. So Decca didn't actually start in business to actually make music. It started in business to make the equipment that you played music on. And it wasn't until the late 1920s when a gentleman, a stockbroker, an English stockbroker by the name of Edward Lewis, got involved with Decca, that they then started to branch out into music. And I think it was Edward Lewis who spearheaded this. I think, to paraphrase the guy, what he said was, hey, look here, hey, look, guys, we're missing out on a trick here in terms of money. We can actually, instead of just making the equipment to play the music on, we should actually be making the music as well to go with it. So from the 1930s, I think it was, Decca Records as a label actually began, and I think some of the artists that appeared on there during the 30s and 40s include Judy Garland. I think Louis Armstrong was another one. How they got into radar, it was through a gentleman by the name of, his name escapes me now, I think it was Harvey Schwartz, who was a sound engineer at Decca. And it was sometime in the late 1930s or mid-1930s that Harvey Schwartz suggested that perhaps what Decca should be getting into is radar, which at the time, if I'm not mistaken, I think at the time radar was still in its infant phase. I think that radar at that time was still a very new thing. It was still something that was being developed. It hadn't sort of come of age as it was. So what Harvey Schwartz suggested, this sound engineer at Decca, what he suggested is that Decca should get into this field of research and start to see if it could get into radar and start to manufacture it. And what they came up with was the Decca navigator system. And this was actually used in the D-Day landings by the Allied forces, the invasion of Normandy, wasn't it, in France in 1944. And I have come across, according to some of the research that I've come across, some of the findings I've come across, some of the data, that the D-Day landings, the success of the D-Day landings was thanks in large part to the Decca navigator system, which was used, the radar system that was used thanks to Decca. It was thanks to that there was this success with the D-Day mission of 1944. And then what happened after that, after the war ended in 1945, the Decca navigator system, thanks to the success of that, then became the Decca Navigator Company, which is what I mentioned earlier. So Decca then went into full business in the manufacture and the production and the research into radar as well. So
yeah, it's fascinating. Even in Vietnam, they had patches. The soldiers wore patches. Vietnam 16 Single Company, Decca Pocket Patch. So they were heavily involved in the Vietnam War. Let me ask you, moving on. You have these fascinating pictures of a studio that was built in the 50s in America, the Decca Records, with this incredible architecture. What can you tell us about that? The photos are on the article. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't know too much about it. What you'll find on the article is what I've kind of written about it is what I've basically found. I haven't left anything out at all. It's a building that housed the American branch of Decca Records, because Decca did branch out across the world, and the American branch of Decca Records had this building in New York, which was used. I think it was his offices in New York, like its headquarters, if you like, but it also had recording facilities in there, and it was part of. I think it was a hotel, but it was called the Pythian Temple Building, and it belonged to the Knights of Pythian, the Knights of Pythia, a fraternal order. And yeah, if you go take a look at my article on Conspiro Media, if you go take a look at this article with the information of which I've been talking about, you'll see that and as you say, I've put some pictures of this Pythian temple building on there. And how can I describe it? Well, it's very Masonic looking. It's it's upside down triangles, Egyptian kind of statues. I think I've got a quote on the website. I'm actually looking at the article now, and there's a quote here. It's been described as a blockbuster synthesis of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Assyrian motifs. That's how the building is described. And yeah, I mean, if you go take a look, as I say, it's very Egyptian looking, very, very Masonic looking. And the building belonged to the Knights of Pythia, a fraternal order, as I say. And it's like, I think it was a hotel.
What I found fascinating was that Buddy Holly would record there, Bill Haley and the Comets, and Rock Around the Clock, which is considered to be the first rock and roll song. The birth of rock and roll was in this Masonic temple. It's Pythian joint, And Buddy Holly died. Buddy Holly died. A suspicious plane crash, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a hotel building. The thing is, I don't know if the Knights of Pythia were actually using it as a hotel, or they bought it when it was a hotel, and they just bought it as a going interest and then just closed the hotel down. But I think, like you say, Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley and his Comets, I think was recorded. I think one of the recording studios, or the recording studio, was actually in the ballroom. Yeah. Or Rock Around the Clock was recorded in the ballroom section, or what would have been used as the ballroom in this hotel or ex-hotel or whatever it was. But in this building, it was recorded in that particular part of the building. And yeah, you say suspicious air crash. I mean, I have yet to look into the Buddy Holly air crash, but I have read rumours and claims. I don't know what you know about this, but there was some kind of insurance kind of scam going on with the crash.
I know there's an expert on the crash that goes around and does interviews. I never took down his information to contact him myself, but he has very elaborate theories. So let's move on to EMI, though, the company that launched the Beatles.
Yes, so you got EMI, again, another British company. And it's actually, EMI got into radar right in the beginning. I think it actually it was the RDF2 radar, the first ever airborne radar to be made and to be used. That's an EMI production, and I think that was just prior to the Second World War, or just as it started. I can't quite remember, but it was sometime around there. But if you look at the invention of stereo sound, which of course now is, it's everywhere. It's part of our lives. When we watch or listen to anything, it's stereo sound. There it is. It's part of our everyday life, part of the mainstream. Hardly think about it. But it was actually invented by EMI, if you like. It's an EMI invention, thanks to an individual by the name of Blumlein. His surname was Blumlein. Again, another sound engineer. He was a sound engineer at EMI in the 1930s, a British guy. I can't remember his first name. I think it was Alan Blumlein. Yes, it was Alan D. Blumlein was his actual name, and he's one of these people that you would call not a mad genius, but he was one of these genius type figures, an inventor, a sound engineer and an inventor, an electrics expert, good at electronics. And he's the guy that's actually, whilst he was working for EMI, he's the guy that's actually credited with inventing stereo sound, or as he called it, he used to call it binaural sound. And how he came to the story that we're given on how he came to invent or think of the concept for stereo was what happened was one evening he went to a movie theatre in the 1930s with his wife, and he was watching a movie, and as he was watching the movie, it came to his realization that the sound that he was getting from the speakers didn't really represent what should be coming from the speakers in terms the way he saw it was the speaker should, in theory, represent what the human ear hears. But but back then in the 1930s, loudspeakers, the loudspeakers back then didn't really represent what the human ear, how the human ear picks up sound. So, for example, he was watching this movie, just kind of paraphrasing the story, kind of how he would have thought of it. He was watching this movie, and there's a guy on the screen. He's moving from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, and he's talking while he's walking. In theory, as he's walking from left to right, the sound in your ear, the sound that should be coming from the speaker should be going from left to right. But of course, as it would with the human ear. But of course, it wasn't. It was all coming all at once from the speaker. It was all just coming in one block. And it was then that he thought that if there was that it came to his realization that there should be some kind of way that the loudspeaker should be able to do this, that it should be able to represent what the human ear hears. So that's where he got the idea for stereo. So he ran away with this idea, began to develop it. Stereo sound didn't actually go into the marketplace in terms of music, not in a huge mass mainstream way until about the 1950s. That's when stereo sound was really, when it really burst onto the scene on records, on vinyl, radio, whatever. Where it actually made its debut was in a military setting. And this was largely thanks to the Royal Air Force, the RAF, during the Second World War. What was happening was, during the Second World War, now, thanks, as I mentioned earlier, EMI had developed this RDF2, this airborne radar, just prior to World War II. And once the Second World War had began, EMI's manufacturing and production and research into radar had really picked up a pace. So it was working closely with the British military, in terms of supplying radar. So here we are in World War II, and there was this problem that the British forces had, the British Air Force had, the Royal Air Force, the RAF. They had this problem where they were flying over the waters, trying to track enemy submarines below them underwater. And they were finding it very, very difficult to do this. The problem is that the sound of the vibrations that were coming from the propellers of the British submarines and the German enemy submarines were almost identical. And it was very, very difficult for the British Air Force to be able to differentiate between the sounds of the two. So what happened was, because of this, British aircraft did actually bomb British submarines. I don't know how many times this happened, but it said that it did happen at least once or twice. It did occur. So they had to find a way of being able to differentiate the sound. And it was the RAF that came up with the idea of being able to record the sound of the enemy submarine, so that then the British forces could then differentiate between the two. So they could then identify which one was the enemy submarine and which one wasn't the enemy submarine. So EMI, and please, don't tell me how they did it, but essentially because I'm no good with this kind of technical stuff. Absolute, embarrassing. But what I can tell you is what happened is that Alan Blumlein, what he did was he took the principles of what he was then working on with the stereo idea. He took the principles of what he was working on with that, and he came up with this system in which what he did was, sorry, just looking at my notes here. Oh God, I've got it wrong. I've actually got it wrong.
Clarify something. You made an error.
Yeah. I got my facts right, but I got them all in the wrong order. Yeah. So I was talking about this this way of recording to be able to differentiate between the submarines, so that the British could identify which submarine was the enemy one and which one was the British one, so they didn't bomb the wrong submarine. That was actually, it wasn't to do with Alan Blumlein and EMI. That was to do with Decca. And this was later used in recording. If you look at some record labels, some Decca record labels, you'll see what's an acronym, FFRR, which means full frequency range recordings. And this was meant to be this revolutionary new sound that came, that was largely started in the 1950s by Decca Records. And this form of technology, this new revolutionary form of sound, actually came from the Second World War. And it's not to do with stereo, as I said earlier. I've got my facts mixed up there.
Yeah, that's minor, though. But people, they're concerned about the accuracy of the article. At the bottom of the article, there's about 75 reference links that you can go and research the facts in the article yourself. One thing I was really fascinated about was you talk about with Abbey Road Studios. And by the way, off the air, I was telling you about that documentary, Echo in the Canyon. There's a scene in there where they show a picture of the technicians at Abbey Road Studios, and they're wearing white lab coats, okay, like they're scientists or doctors or something. Really creeped me out. But tell us the sort of story about Paul McCartney and George Martin.
Yeah, this is EMI again.
Right.
The dreaded EMI, some might say. The thing with stereo sound, just to clear that up, the thing with stereo sound, what they did with the FFRR and the Decca thing, what they did was the Royal Air Force suggested to Decca to be able to differentiate between the sounds of the submarines. What Decca did was invented a wax cutting device that was able to record sound. So it took a captured submarine, a propeller, and recorded the sound of the propeller. And what Decca then did was to manufacture those discs many times over and give them to the British troops, to the British Air Force, who were then able to listen to the sound, and then they were able to tell the difference between the British ones and the German ones, the propellers. So then they were able to bomb more successfully. So that's how the Decca FFRR system came into being. And the stereo system was used before stereo sound in the 50s on records. It was actually used during the war, thanks to Alan Blumlein, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of they used it again, I don't know how he did it, but he used the principles of stereo sound to come up with what was called the VIE, visual indicator equipment, which was a mobile radar. And he used the principles of stereo before stereo was ever used in music, which was first used in the 50s. He used it for this, to invent this, through EMI, to invent this sound locator, which was basically a mobile radar on wheels with these great big huge horned speaker type things that are on the back of it. And there's a picture of it. If you go take a look at my article that I mentioned earlier, if you go take a look at that, you'll see it. But yeah, with regards to EMI, also in the article, I mentioned this conversation that takes place between Paul McCartney and George Martin, the Beatles producer, and this conversation took place sometime in the 2000s, maybe 2010s, off the top of my head. And it was taken from, and I've taken the conversation that's in the article from a documentary that was on the BBC some years back. I think it was called Produced by George Martin, which was basically an hour-long documentary about the life and times of George Martin. And I don't know why they included this particular reminiscence in the actual documentary, because it doesn't kind of fit with the rest of it. I mean, if you've seen the documentary, or if you want to go and see it, you might agree with me. Kind of doesn't fit. Yeah, okay. It's true that George Martin, during the war, he did work for the Royal Navy. I think it was the Royal Navy, I think in the Fleet Air Arm, so he was airborne most of the time. But he was only in that for a short amount of time. And yes, this does get mentioned in the documentary, but when you consider that most of the documentary is about his career as a music producer, I am a little bit just questioning why they should throw this in. But anyway, what happened is there's parts during the documentary where George is talking to Ringo and he's talking to Paul about his time as producer of the Beatles. And there's one particular reminiscence where Paul McCartney is sitting in, I think it's in a recording studio, and I think, George Martin is sitting next to him, and and Paul looks to George and he says something along the lines of, and again I'm paraphrasing here, he says something along the lines of, "Hey George, do you remember back in the 60s when us and the boys, the Beatles, used to work in the studio?" And he starts to remind George Martin of this conversation that they had back in the 60s about how the Nazi Party Nazi rallies would mess around with sound frequencies. And what they did was, the way that Paul McCartney, off the top of my head, I think how he described it was, the Nazi Party at rallies, in order to get the audiences, the people at the rallies to go crazy for Adolf Hitler when he took to the podium, was they would have these sound frequencies and they would turn them really, really, really low, to the point that it would make the crowds feel slightly physically ill, physically sick. And then as soon as Adolf Hitler was about to take to the podium, what they would do is they would then turn the frequency up a lot higher in order, and what it would do, and this is how George Martin was explaining it to the Beatles back in the 60s in the recording studio, by turning up the frequency, it would send this elation through the audience, and the audience would then become excited. So as Adolf Hitler is taking to the stage to address his audience, everybody by this time is like screaming and cheering, and they're so happy to see their Führer. It's just odd that this reminiscence, if you like, was added into this documentary, and the telling thing for me was at the end of this reminiscence, Paul looks to George and then looks to the screen, and he says, kind of in a off the cuff way, "I used to love those stories, George, that you used to tell us during the recording process back in the Beatles days." During the recording process. So someone with a conspiratorial type ear might hear that as thinking, well, why would George Martin be talking about this? Is it just studio banter? Is it just out of hours studio chat, a little bit of off the cuff kind of pleasurable talk? Or when McCartney says during the recording process, is this something that George Martin is hoping that perhaps the Beatles would or should take into account during the recording process in terms of frequencies and how they can be used, or how they can be used to influence the listeners?
If Martin was aware of these techniques, I can't imagine that he would hesitate using them. How do you think he knew what Hitler's techniques was with frequencies and stuff and audio?
Well, that's right. Exactly. That's my thought. How would he have known this? Yeah. He wasn't high up as far as I'm aware, he wasn't high up in the military when he served during the war, and then as soon as the war ended, he came out of the forces. I think he was an officer. I think he got as far as an officer, but he wasn't anything, high up in the ranks. I don't think he was, well, as far as I'm aware, in terms of official history, he wasn't involved in intelligence. So yeah, I mean, how would he know this stuff? It's very difficult now, let alone in this day and age with the internet and everything, to be able to find anything that's concrete, as it were, in terms of facts with regards to that kind of thing, and how frequencies might have been used. So it's difficult to pin that down now in being able to confirm it. So yeah, I mean, how did he get hold of this kind of stuff?
Matt, we only have about 4 minutes left. Do you have time to tell us the history with CBS, or is there anything strange you want to tell us about Abbey Road Studios?
Well, I'll quickly say that CBS, of course, is Columbia, and I'll just quickly say that Columbia's roots are not in music. Columbia's roots are in government. Hence, so it's been suggested why Columbia, the record label, and then the TV network with CBS, which was later what it spawned into, and now which is Sony, because it was bought and turned into Sony. The reason it's said that it's called Columbia is because of the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. As I say, Columbia's roots have nothing to do with music. Columbia actually began as the Columbia Phonograph Company, or the Graphophone Company. And
so much with the CBS we can get into forever. But we are out of time. Yeah. Matthew, Sergiou, thank you so much. Always come prepared with great content. People, please check out the conspiromedia.com. And what's the other one, too, with the Beatles?
The Occult Beatles. You can find that if you go to wordpress.com. But if you just type in the Occult Beatles into a search engine, that should come up. And I also have a Facebook page, Conspiro Media at Facebook. And if you go there, you'll find everything on there. It's like a compilation, if you like, of everything. So
excellent. Matt, Sergiou, thank you so much.